Introduction to XML course, and to let you know that it's my desire to really get you grounded in XML in this course and give you a good, thorough understanding as to what XML is, what you can do with it, and hopefully to plant some ideas and make you feel more comfortable with this. Now, let me give you the first disclaimer on the course before we get started. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and some of you guys from a little north, farther north than Tennessee might notice a slight accent. I have some clients that I do some training for, some live training in Chicago from time to time, in Minneapolis. They always give me a hard time about my accent, so just like I do for them, I'll do for you. I'll give you a heads up when I'm about to use some sort of southern technical term, such as fixing to or so forth. So try to skip the accent and let's focus on XML. But in this course, I want to give you some very simple descriptions, some simple examples of what XML is, how to correctly build it, how to use it, the advantages, and yes, even the disadvantages to XML. Now, XML is everywhere, and one of the best things that you can do for your career in the near term is to get your hands and your brain around XML, because it's going to continue to show up more and more. And sometimes I'm surprised by the number of people who've heard of XML but don't really know what it is. This course is going to take care of that. So with all that in mind, let's jump into the course and start learning. Now, as we get started, let's go over course prerequisites and the setup that you'll need to work in the same environment that you see me working in the video. First up, you need to have a really good understanding of HTML. Now, if you don't know what HTML is and you've never used it, I would suggest that you get your hands on, teach yourself HTML in 24 hours or 3 weeks or whatever it is. You might want to grab just an HTML for Dummies book and just get the basics down on it. This is the markup language that we use inside a browser. And this is what tells the browsers, such as Internet Explorer and so forth, how to make the web page show up. But understand, you don't have to know HTML to totally understand and get anything out of this course, but the better you understand HTML, the more you're going to get from this, because I'm going to do a lot of comparisons between XML and HTML, simply because HTML has kind of been the standard out there in data, especially on the web for quite a while. Scripting, the more you understand about scripting as well, the more you're going to get some of the pieces of this, especially when we get into XSLT and some of the transformations. You don't have to be a VB script guru or a JavaScript freak to be able to really get a lot out of this. But again, the more you're comfortable with scripting, the more you're going to understand, especially when we talk about the document object model and SACs and some of that stuff. So again, if you're not familiar with scripting, I don't want to scare you off, but just understand when we get to those places, you may have to watch the video a couple of times to understand what's going on. Now, the web browser, we're going to be viewing XML through the web browser most of the time in this course. Now, I'm going to use Internet Explorer 6.0. You need, and I would strongly suggest that you have Internet Explorer 6.0 on your machine. Now, you're going to see me jump out there and open some things up, like in Firefox, Mozilla's Firefox, maybe in Avant and so forth. But for most of the examples that you're going to see, your Internet Explorer. Now, there's one good reason for that. And for all the people who like to bash Microsoft, and especially in the XML world, there's tons of them. You may be one, that's fine. But Internet Explorer so far has provided some of the best functionalities and support for XML technologies. Now, we'll talk about differences, and yes, I know about the differences where Microsoft kind of shoves ideas out there that aren't standard. We'll talk about some of those issues as we go through here. But let me show you. I'm running Internet Explorer 6.0, and let me jump out to my desktop. And I want to show you how to make sure you're running Internet Explorer 6.0. I don't want to assume anything here. This is an intro course. If I double-click Internet Explorer, you'll notice I'm connected to the Internet. If I click on Help, and we're going to get all these pop-ups. On Help, if I come down to About Internet Explorer, you'll notice here it's telling me this is version 6.0, and I'm running Service Pack 1. Now, if you don't have that, go out to Microsoft's site, download Internet Explorer 6.0 or later, put it on your machine, and your examples will work just great, just like mine. Well, if mine work great. You'll see the good, the bad, the ugly here. One of the things you're going to learn about XML, it's a very particular language, and so I'm going to show you some of the good and the bad and the ugly so that you'll learn from my mistakes as well. So, with Internet Explorer installed, Then you'll need to use Notepad. Now, what I'm going to do with Notepad, and the reason I'm using Notepad is because you need to understand XML. There are some fabulous tools out there, and I'm going to show you some in the course. XML Spy and some other ones. But you need to understand XML. If you've ever built a web page using Microsoft's front page, it's great. You can drag and drop and you can make everything sing and hum. The problem is when you get backed into a corner, you need to really understand that HTML to be able to get in there and fix some things. And if you don't, you're just kind of, in trouble. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Notepad because it's very generic, it's free, it's on your system already. And let me show you a little trick that I'm going to use throughout the course here. So let's again go back out to the desktop. You'll notice on my desktop there is a new text document right here, and the way I put it there, and what I'm going to do is I'll just double click this and open a notepad and begin to write XML. If you will right click on your desktop, go to New and choose Text Document, and if you click on that, that will put a text document on your desktop and you can work from there. And we will just kind of throw files out on the desktop. It's not the neatest, cleanest way, but it is the easiest way. That's what we're after here. So that's the prereqs and the setup. You should be ready to go now, so let's take off. Now, as we get started, let me give you an overview of the course because XML is a huge topic. And so what I've tried to do is distill this down. And what I want to give you is, as an introduction to XML, the bare bones basics of XML. What I want you to get from the course, these are my objectives, is for you to understand, first of all, what XML is, how it works, and what it does. And if you can answer these three questions about XML at the end of this video series, you will then be ready to go out and implement XML, because implementation becomes the rub on XML. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to try my best to give you a generic introduction because I want to avoid the debates that have been raging out there for years. And this gets pretty strong. As a matter of fact, in the book that's put out by O'Reilly, and O'Reilly has some fantastic books, don't get me wrong, but O'Reilly even goes as far as to say, and you'll seldom see this kind of stuff in a book, but on page 147 of the third edition of XML in a nutshell, when they're talking about style sheet processors, and I'm just going to read the line, it's kind of interesting, I think it's actually kind of funny. They're talking about Microsoft's namespace declarations, and they're talking about a declaration that Microsoft came out with for a namespace when they were ahead of the recommendations, and it's kind of hung on. And their statement is, good XSLT developers don't use, and they refer to that old namespace, and they don't associate with developers who do. So there's a lot of debates out there about how to do XML, why it should be done, and exactly, and so forth. I want to avoid those debates. Those will come very clear to you, and I want to stay out of the Java, Microsoft, IBM wars, and so forth. Now, understand as you go through here, I'm going to use a Microsoft Internet Explorer browser quite a bit, and I will tend to talk about XML more so from a Microsoft standpoint for two reasons. First of all, honestly, I'm a Microsoft certified systems engineer, I'm a Microsoft programmer, I'm a Microsoft database administrator. I tend to live in that world. But the next best reason for this is, and I'm not taking anything away from anybody else's XML tools or anything, for most people watching this, they're going to be watching on Windows-based machines, and they already have Internet Explorer, and it's much easier to follow along. What you need to take from this is not a debate about the various XML technology platforms out there, but XML itself, and that's certainly what I'm trying to give you. Please hear me on this. Java has some incredible tools. I'm not knocking them. We'll talk about SACs and some other things in here. What I want you to get is an understanding of what XML is, how it works, what it accomplishes. I'm going to give you some very simple examples. I love to learn stuff and I love to teach stuff using very simple examples. If you can grasp how the technology is thinking, you can then mold it to what you need it to do. Then I'm going to direct you to some resources all throughout the videos to tell you where you can go and get some more information to dig a little deeper in the various aspects. The million-dollar question with everybody is, how do I use this? And so the question for me is, how will you, as a student in this course, utilize XML? Well, it depends on a number of questions. Number one, where you are right now. What are you doing? What data needs do you have? And how does XML fit into that? What do you need? Do you need to just bind data to web pages? Do you need to send data across the world and have it retain its meaning? Are you trying to populate databases? And then where are you going? What are the long-range plans for how this data is going to be used? And also we get into network utilization and some other issues. So what you do with XML and how you use XML depends on where you are, what you need, where you're going. It also will change from time to time based on the platform that you're using. If you're in a Java shop, you're going to do XML a little bit differently with the tools and parsers and so forth, but you're still going to be using standard XML data. Same thing for Microsoft, same thing for IBM, same thing for anybody else. So that's the overview of the course. I just want to give you a good, thorough, rounding understanding of XML, what it does, how you can use it, how to manipulate it, how it's thinking. I'll leave exactly how to implement it and what tools to use up to you. To get you up to speed on XML, let's take a step back and take a look at data history and how XML came to us. First of all, back in the early days of computers, and this is back in the mainframe days, data was always in a proprietary format. It was unique to the manufacturer of the computer system that was running the data or using the data, and it was also unique to the platform. In the early days, the Microsoft Apple wars, data was unique between them, and these machines did not talk to each other. In my early years with one of the telecommunications firms in the Southeast, we went to Atlanta one year and saw this demonstration that absolutely just flipped us out. We couldn't believe we were looking at it. They actually had an IBM like an XT or an AT sitting there with a cable between them, and it was transferring data or sharing data with an Apple Macintosh, and we just couldn't believe we were actually seeing that happen. We wonder what mad scientist had brought this about, because in those days, data was pretty much locked into the platform or the manufacturer that you were dealing with. HTML, now keep in mind, this data history is not necessarily chronological because a lot of these things were in an overlap and some happened before others and so forth. HTML, the hypertext markup language, came along, and it was a subset of SGML and so forth. But this at least provided standard markup. Now this came from the Defense Department and from the world of the universities and colleges and so forth. But everybody was looking for a way to just pass generic data that at least they could mark it up and see it between systems, regardless of who built them or why they built them or who was running them and so forth. They just wanted to get the data. And this early data was passed across just in Courier font, and it wasn't very fancy and so forth. So HTML gave us a standard markup. Now it was browser based, and this set off the browser wars between Microsoft, Netscape, and the other folks. But HTML gave us a way to run a browser on any platform and then open up an HTML document in that browser and share the data between the platforms. And this was very cool. However, some limitations became very apparent about HTML after just a short period of time. One of the things that really added to that limitation was the database explosion that took place in the 90s. A little company out there called Ashton Tate released a product called DBase. Also, Microsoft introduced Access, and there were quite a few databases out there. So if I didn't mention your favorite, forgive me. But a lot of these little databases weren't really relational in the truest sense of the word, but they gave us a real good introduction. Now, what happened was people realized, hey, wait a minute. In the internet world, I can collect a lot of data from people. And if I can store it in a database, then I can, then hand it back to them, or I can learn all kinds of information and so forth. And so the database explosion on top of HTML was really cool, because now we could put information in databases, and we started to get a lot more sophisticated with our web pages and so forth. Then HTML really began to show its limitations, because since it was just a markup language, once I delivered that data to the browser, I pretty much lost the meaning of the data. It was only identified by the markup terms that the browser used. Along came XML. Now, XML actually first was born as an idea back in November 1996. Now, if you go out to the W3C site, which I'll talk about later, you can look up the history of XML. It got a slow start, slowly gained speed, and now it's kind of become the standard. Now, XML is a markup, the extensible markup language. It lets us mark up the data that the browser is going to show, but the data is still self-describing, and I'll explain this in an upcoming video where we talk about exactly what XML is. But understand that even though the data has been pulled from a database or served from a web server, the tags around it still describe it to us. It's self-describing. And this has further fulfilled the promise of HTML. This is standardized data. Now, in an XML world, I can send you data that you can open up and tell exactly what this data is and how this data should be formatted on the screen. What's even better, you can then query this data for your own subset of data from it. You can compare this data to other pieces of data, and you can determine, for example, how it should be marked up. Do you want to see it in a browser in a certain size, a certain color? Do you want to see it as a PDF document? What? It's pretty much limitless. So that's kind of how the data history has led us to XML. Now, through most of the course, I'll compare XML to HTML, and that's why we have that prerequisite out there about HTML. The more you know about HTML, the easier it is to get your hands and your head around XML. So that's how we got XML. Now let's go take a look a little deeper into what XML is, how it looks, and how it behaves. Probably the most appropriate question to start an XML course with is exactly what is XML? And that's what most people want to know in live training classes. So let's take a look at XML. The best way to show you what XML is to compare it to HTML. So let's go to the desktop and do that. Now you'll notice on my desktop I have a new text document. I've already talked about that. I'll double click it and open it. And what I'm going to do here is create just a very simple little HTML document. Now, I'll warn you that I have a tough time talking and typing at the same time, so I'll do my best with it here. But notice, very simple HTML document, and we'll open the body, and we'll put some data in the body. So with the heading level of 1, I'll put 87654, close the tag. Then at a heading level of 4, I will put 76.33. Now, in the real world, I might have pulled this information from a database, and I've rendered it as HTML, and it's in the browser now. Now, if I save this, and this is very important, notice I do File, Save As, come down to Save As Type, and tell it All Files, and then give it a name with an extension, and I'm going to call this HTML example.htm, save it on the desktop, and then close my notepad. Now notice, here's my file. If I double click it, you'll notice what happens when Internet Explorer opens this. I see my numbers here, but that's all I see. And I've formatted them, so the markup's cool here. The problem is, and notice how I do this, right click on my HTML file, say Open With, and choose Notepad. Notice my data, what is an 87654 and what is a 76.33? All we know is the size that they should appear in the browser. So what I'll do now is, actually let me leave that open, and what I want to do now is create an XML file. So again, I'll open an empty text document, and now I'm going to create an XML file. And don't worry about all this other stuff that I'm putting in. This is just what I have to have, and we'll talk about how and why later. In an XML document, I have to have a root, so I will say products, notice item number, then cost. Now, a little light probably just came on about what XML is about and what it does. And let me finish this up. Now notice what XML is doing here. XML is using tags that we can build ourselves to describe the data. Is there any doubt now what 87654 is? It's an item number, and it's one of the items that our company sells. What's the cost of this item number? Well, the cost is $76.33. Now, we're assuming that's dollars. We'll talk about how to know that later, how to point that out in our XML document. And so for now, let's save the XML file. I need to do a save as. Let's go to save as type, set it to all files, and let's do XML, ex.xml, and save that. Now, if we open this file, let's look at what's going to happen. So I'll close these two, and you'll notice we now have an XML file right here on our desktop. So if I double click that file, notice Internet Explorer opens it up, and now instead of doing formatting on it, it shows us the actual XML file. And another thing that's kind of interesting, notice we can expand or collapse the various levels of this in Internet Explorer. Now, that's what XML is. It is self-describing the data, and we'll talk about how this helps us and what the big deal is about this in upcoming videos. Now let's talk about XML's history just a second. If you go, I'm on the, notice the W3C site, and if you go to /XML/HIST 2002, you'll get a history of XML. Now notice there's quite a bit here. And if I pull down to the bottom, you'll notice that the XML, the first initial XML draft came out in November of 1996. Which means XML is about 10 years old. Now, when it first came out, we heard that it was going to change the way we eat, sleep, think, drive our cars, and use our computers. Now, we've heard that before about other technologies. As it turns out, XML could well do that because XML has opened the door for computer systems to interchange data very easily. Now, as you notice, as you look through this history document, and I would suggest that you go through and read some of these and take a look at them. Now, there's, admittedly, some of this stuff, the best use for it is those nights when you're having trouble falling asleep. Pull one of these up, start reading it, and it'll take care of the problem. But what you will see here is when XML first came out, it was XML, small world. Then the universe began to expand, and it is really expanding now as it continues to solve more problems, take care of more issues. And you notice here, the W3C has done a really good job of documenting and keeping up with what's happened with XML. And you can see the various things that happened with it down through the years. And so far, they're going all the way through January 2001. Now, as you look through this is a great way to get some background on XML. And if you really want to understand everything that's happening with XML, read through this stuff. You will see what's going on with it. So I just wanted to point you to this. This is not something you necessarily need to use XML, but to really get deep with XML, you need to know some of the discussions, suggestions, and so forth that's come through the developmental history of XML. And you can find that out on that W3C site. Involvement with XML is going to inevitably lead you to the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium, and I just want to show you this and let you know what they are and what they do. A couple of real interesting things. Notice I'm on the W3C organization's consortium webpage, and this is their About the World Wide Web, explains who they are, what they do. Very interesting here. If you notice this man's photograph, this is Tim Berners-Lee. You can see on your screen there. Notice this guy's the director of W3C and the inventor of the World Wide Web. Now, forget all the Al Gore jokes and so forth. This guy is one, he and another team of folks invented the World Wide Web. Now, he worked for CERN, a European organization, back in the 80s, and they came up with this idea. But notice the W3C's mission statement here: to lead the World Wide Web to its full potential by developing protocols and guidelines that ensure long-term growth for the web. Now, the way it works is the W3C takes all kind of suggestions, anything you got, and they adopt these or suggest these as standards. Now, notice you can be members of the W3C and so forth, but ultimately, when you want to learn something for sure about XML, this is the place you need to come. These guys are kind of handling the standardization and implementation of XML, as there are a lot of other web technologies. I'll click and go to the home page of the World Wide Web Consortium, and if you'll notice down the left side, here are some of the various technologies that they're overseeing. Now, if we scroll on down to the bottom down here, you will notice XML shows up. And here's XML, and by clicking on this link, we can start off and look at XML specifications, working groups, and so forth. So use this as a resource. The W3C is the governing body that's determining how XML is implemented, in what fashion and what format, and we'll talk about this, believe it or not, when we talk about some of the Microsoft implementations of this. Most companies have little quirks about how they've implemented XML, and then usually in later versions they come back into specs. So you need to understand XML is a developing technology. It's also an evolving technology. So don't really marry too closely some of the things that you're doing here, because they are going to somewhat change over time. Although it's fairly safe to say that the basic workings of XML are pretty much set in stone at this point. So this is your resource to go to. And let me point out something right down here in the middle of the page. Notice they're saying this is not the place to find tutorials, products, courses, or books, or other XML related information. This is just to show you how XML is being governed and some of the purposes of it and so forth. Now, as soon as most people see XML and HTML compared, they begin to think then all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, what's the big deal? What's the difference between these two ultimately? Well, we already talked about the fact that HTML is a markup language. We use it simply to tell the browser how to make stuff show up. HTML is limited with the standard tags, the H1, the H2, body, table, and so forth. And this is the biggest one. HTML was very forgiving. You could type sloppy code in HTML, open a tag, not close it. The browser would say, I know what he means. I'll just go ahead and do it. It would make assumptions for you, an attempt to show the data. Also, HTML didn't necessarily check for properly nested items and so forth. We'll talk about that later and show you exactly what I mean. But HTML made us really fat and lazy about the way we coded web pages. XML has changed all of that, because XML, while it is a markup language very, very similar to HTML, which is a good thing, which means that what you know about HTML has not been wasted energy in learning that. You're still going to apply the same stuff. The big difference with XML is two of them. It's self-describing. I can create my own tags to describe my data, so that once the data is delivered to the web browser, I can go back into the raw data and get more information about my data. Now, this is the one that gets most HTML people. It is case sensitive. So if I've got a tag called form in all caps, and then I got another tag called form in lower caps, XML sees these as two different tags. So it is case sensitive, and that'll drive you nuts at first. Also, XML is not forgiving at all. There are some standard structures that have to be satisfied in XML, or you can't open the documents. Now, this is huge, though, because if I'm going to write a document that's going to pass data to you and you're on a different system than I am, then you're going to have some sort of mechanism to make sure that you know, number one, what's the schema or the structure of this data, and does this data meet any requirements as far as structure or content that I need to accept this data? Also, XML is very standardized, and these standards will change from time to time. And I'll show you some examples as we go through where standardization is sliding a little bit between manufacturers and how it will be caught up in the future. Now, very important here, XML is not a replacement for HTML. There's a lot of places where HTML is absolutely fine. As a matter of fact, you're going to see in this course, very often we take XML data and convert it to HTML to put it into a browser and format it properly. So you're going to see HTML is still here to stay. Now, there is one little caveat to that, and that is XHTML. And what's happened is we've taken HTML now, and HTML more or less stopped at version 4. The next version of HTML actually became XHTML, which is simply HTML with the rules cleaned up. HTML with XML rules applied. It is case sensitive. It requires proper nesting and so forth. I'll show you an example of that later. But I wanted you to kind of get acclimated to the difference between XML and HTML, because while this is an XML course, you're going to see us use quite a bit of HTML as we move through some of these exercises. Now, before we delve too far into the XML world, let's kind of step back a minute, and I want to talk to you about the expanding XML universe. XML, we've already talked about, is the self-describing markup language. This thing does some cool magic for us. It lets us transfer data between computers and computer systems, regardless of what platform they're on, regardless of what language they're written in, and so forth. This is some fabulous stuff. However, when XML first came out, and was first mentioned, everybody was like, oh, this is cool. Then more and more X-type acronyms continued to show up. Right now, if you walk in your local bookstore every 2 or 3 weeks, it seems, there's another 1,000-page book out there with some sort of X acronym on it and has to do with XML. The main one that you're going to see in this course is XSL, and that is the Extensible Style Sheet Language. Now, this one can easily be divided into 2 pieces. Now, a lot of times out there, let me warn you, you'll see these acronyms all intermingled without any apparent relationship between them, and for the most part you don't have to worry about it, but I want to show it to you here so that you'll kind of see the relation between these things. Within the XSL family of languages, there's XSLT. Now this is the one you will probably use most, and I say probably because it depends really on what you're doing with XML, but it means the Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformations, because we will use XSLT to more or less take an XML document, apply an XSLT query, if you will. Query is not really a good word, but it's the best one to understand it. And we will tell it to use this query to reference the original XML document and create a new resulting document based on that query in our XSLT transformation sheet. So you'll see this quite a bit later on in the course. Then there's XSLFO. The FO means formatting objects. XSLFO exposes the document to it, or lets us get at the document down to a more granular level than cascading style sheets, and we can do a lot more with the document from a formatting standpoint easier than you can with cascading style sheets. Now, cascading style sheets are apparently still the standard. XSLFO, as a matter of fact, is still not supported by most of the browsers and so forth. So most people are still using cascading style sheets, but XSLFO will eventually move in and kind of take over the universe in that area. Also, under XSLT and XSLFO is XPath. Now, XPath is the actual language that we use to write the queries or write the formatting objects. Now, this is a bit confusing, so let me make sure I say this right. XML really is a self-describing markup language, or it's a self-describing language for data. It really represents more, if you want to think of it, database data in a hierarchical format in a text file. XPath allows us to programmatically go through that document and parse it, if you will. So XPath is the language that we use to write our queries in that lets us parse through these documents. Now, you'll also hear about XLink. XLink is hypertext links on steroids, if you will. XLink lets you link between XML documents, just like you can use your hrefs, your hypertext links between HTML documents. Now, one thing though you need to understand, in the XML world with XLink, not only can you link to a document, but you can link back to the document you came from very easily, or link to a different document. So you got a little bit more functionality with XLink. Then there's XPointer. This works hand in hand with XLink because XPointer allows us to link to a certain place. And in reality, in XML, we don't link to another document. We link to a particular point in another document. So a lot of control there. So if I want to direct you to another page to give you more information, I don't just throw you at the page and let you find it. I take you straight to the point in that page where I want you to go. So if we go out to the W3C site, what I'll do is just tab out there. You'll notice on the W3C site, down the left side here, you can see all the XML stuff that's out here. Now here's the original XML. You'll notice there's XForms, I didn't mention that, XML base, binary, XML encryption key, XML query. It continues to go on and on and on. XPath you see there. What I would suggest you do is come out to this site and look around on this stuff. And then notice right here XML key management, XKMS. Now come out here and look around. Make sure you keep up with what's going on. This is fabulous reading. Okay, I've already mentioned if you have trouble sleeping, come out here and read some of this stuff and take care of the problem. But use w3.org, W3C, as your beginning point on learning more and more about these various acronyms and technologies that you're going to see showing up around the XML world. Now that we've covered what XML is roughly, where it came from, how the W3C oversees it, and so forth. I want to give you an XML overview because the number one question everybody wants to know, and I want to make sure you nail this, is the big question is, what can I do with XML? And the answer to that is, what do you want to do with XML? Now, I'm going to give you just a real quick diagram here to show you one of the many possibilities, because what happens is you will use XML in a little bit different way in every different application of XML that you undertake. Look at this simple example first. Let's say that we've got two databases, and these are on different platforms, or they're different databases, or you've got security issues between them, and for some reason you need to trade data between these two databases. Now, this could be any scenario you want, any ones of the ones I just mentioned, or perhaps that this is two different companies. This is one company here, this is another company here, and we're seeing this all the time now in corporate America, that even though two companies may be strong competitors, they do have data and information that behooves them both to share that information and work together. It could be for regulatory purposes, it could be for marketing purposes, it could be all kinds of things. But for whatever reason, these two databases, obviously if they're on different platforms, are very different in structure, in style, and then again, security requirements and so forth means we can't just connect these two databases and share data. So this is one of the places we could use XML, and I just want to plant this in your brain and let you think about this as we go through here, because we're about to talk about what is a document and what's the big deal about XML documents and how they're formed. What I want you to get a picture of is between these two databases where we need to share this data, the one thing that we can do is we can make XML the common denominator between the two databases. Notice we can extract the data that we want to share from our database into an XML document. Now make sure this is where we're concentrating in this course. And what we're actually concentrating on is how this XML document is built, how it's managed, how it's structured. Because the tags that you're going to see in just a few minutes that are in this XML document are totally up to us. The only thing that's mandated by the various recommendations and so forth in the W3C is the structure of this XML document. Therefore, the competing company over here can generate their own XML document, and then in a way that you're going to see later on in the course, we can make sure that these two XML documents are compatible, and then we can transfer information freely between each other. Now, what's going to happen is, if I take this XML document and pass it to this company, then I can do some XML tricks, or I can use the .NET framework or Microsoft, I can use the Java platform or whatever to then parse that XML data and insert it into the database. Same thing here. When this goes over, we'll parse it, put it into the database. That's the beauty of XML. Now again, let me stress, this is going to be somewhat different depending on the various applications you put XML in. Microsoft has enough twists and turns to drive you nuts. Java has enough little differences in there, and these people will argue amongst themselves about which one's the true standard and which one's the better and all that sort of stuff. Try to avoid that. Just determine how you can use XML, and as we go through the video, you'll see this more clearly, and then determine how you want to go about doing it. And I'll show you some of those differences as we move through.